Marin Stein, PhD analyst and supervisor at the International School of Analytical Psychology in Zurich, Switzerland. So graduated as a Jungian psychoanalyst at the C. Jung Institute of Zurich in 1973 and has been president of the International Association for Analytical Psychology since 2001 up to 2004 and president of ICSAT from 08 to 12. So he has been lectures at national conferences and workshops and been the editor of the Jungian psychoanalysis, being the authors of many papers and books. So the latest books edited be the first and the second volume of his collective writings, and one third volume, Transformation, is now being published, Lives and Works in Switzerland. So I'm very pleased to pass the floor to Professor Mari Stein.
Thank you so much for this opportunity.
Grazie mille per questa opportunità.
I would like to share my screen if that's possible. Yes. In his late masterpiece, Mysterium Conjunctionis, C.G. Jung proposed and described 3 stages of the individuation process that take place in the second half of life. This typically begins as a psychological transformation in the second half of life at midlife, which calls into question the previously formed identity and persona with its embedded cultural attitudes, as well as more general ego orientation and goals. Often this development is initiated by a dramatic loss of position, of loved ones, of idealized others, or beliefs. Jung experienced this after his break with Freud at the age of 37. And Dante experienced it following his departure and exile from Florence in his mid-30s. Whereas Jung's overall individuation journey did not end until his death many years later at the age of 86 in 1961 in Küsnacht, Switzerland, Dante's life ended at the age of 56 in 1321 in Ravenna, shortly after completing the Divine Comedy. What we witness in the Divine Comedy is a visionary account of a journey through the land of the dead that displays clear stages of psychological and spiritual development. This journey was experienced and turned into a magnificent work of art by Dante in the second half of his life. Like Jung crafting his Red Book for more than a decade, Dante meticulously composed the Divine Comedy over a similar period of time, from 1308 until 1321, as scholars have estimated. Although the experience he writes about took place, he says, in only a few days, while he was in Rome during Holy Week in the year 1300. Dante tells the story as a recollection, as memory, that he is now recounting in the elevated form of literary art. As a Jungian psychoanalyst, I am looking at the Divine Comedy not as art or literature, but as a depiction of psychological transformation achieved through what Jung called active imagination. The epic poem is the account of an individuation process that begins at midlife in confusion and darkness, a negredo state in the language of alchemy, moves through a long series of confrontations with shadow figures and themes, advances by rigorous psychological reflection and analysis to reach an albedo state, in alchemy known as the whitening, and arrives at the conclusion to a sudden moment of spectacular transformation, issuing in a rubedo state. This is the brilliant reddening in the alchemical process that produces the alchemical gold, the lapis philosophorum, which simultaneously signals the transformation of the alchemist. These three stages of alchemical transformation correspond to the phases of individuation as described by Jung in the final chapter of Mysterium Conjunctionis, where he considers the process described by the alchemist Gerhard Dorn from a psychological perspective. These three stages proceed as follows. 1, the formation and achievement of unio mentalis. 2, the union of unio mentalis with the body. And 3, the union of this product with unus mundus. I will argue that the Dante figure portrayed in the Divine Comedy achieves the state of unio mentalis by the end of the second canticle, Purgatorio. Beatrice meets him there and leads him into the realms of Paradiso, where he takes form as a subtle body that is not subject to gravity, where he receives spiritual instruction from various illustrious teachers and undergoes a set of strict examinations which qualify him for the final numinous vision of the celestial rose and the Holy Trinity. And it is beyond even these that an electrifying transformation occurs, which creates a permanent state of union with the unus mundus. The result of the totality of the experience is psychological wholeness. This is the lens through which I am reading the Divine Comedy. And for me, a question remains open. Did Dante have the experiences described poetically in the Divine Comedy before he composed the poem, or did he have the experience while he was writing the poem? My guess would be that it is both, that he had an original experience and that he crafted it into his magnificent poetry over a period of several years. The details of this story are far too numerous to consider in this short space. The selection of scenes and characters that I've chosen to focus upon are what I consider to be some of the critical turning points of significance in the individuation process depicted in the Divine Comedy. The poem as a whole is a testament to late-stage individuation as an archetypal process, although rarely depicted in this depth and with this degree of consciousness and differentiation. Stage of preparation, achievement of the unio mentalis. In the alchemical paradigm, the soul has a natural inclination toward the body. And at birth, the soul unites with the body and therefore clings compulsively to it thereafter. The body is the world, our material existence. But it is more than that. It is our total life in the world. The soul becomes attached to existence in the world through relationship, initially to mother and father, later to the entire surrounding world of material objects and culture. And this is what the alchemists called unio naturalis. The soul enters into active engagement with the world through the senses, at first and then more fully with the whole conscious psyche as the ego develops a persona. and an identity, a social identity. What remains left out of this union between soul and body is spirit. That is what Jung will call supreme meaning. Spirit is logos in the high sense of the word, absolute meaning. Attachment of the soul to the body world does bring a sense of meaning in the mundane and horizontal sense of being active in worldly affairs, career, family, business, politics. But it does not offer meaning in the vertical sense of absolute meaning on the spiritual plane. The movement toward unio mentalis sets in after the soul's investment in this life, in the body, is complete. And this movement begins upward, begins classically with a crisis at midlife, as we see in the Divine Comedy. The full achievement of unio mentalis requires first an operation to separate the soul from the body, separatio in the alchemical language, and then another operation to unite the soul with the spirit in unio mentalis, which leaves the body behind and dead in a state of mortificatio, in the sense that it is no longer the center of the soul's attention. This is a major moral and psychological achievement, and it constitutes the beginning of the opus of individuation in the later stages. The journey toward unio mentalis begins with entry into the state of negredo. It is a state characterized by confusion and alienation from what had been a familiar world of persona, identity, and activity. The Divine Comedy opens at precisely this point in Dante's life. As he recalls in retrospect, he found himself at this time in a dark wood, alone, his way blocked by 3 fierce, wild animals. Midway on our life's journey, I found myself in dark woods, the right road lost. To tell about these woods is hard, so tangled and rough and savage that thinking of it now, I feel the old fear stirring. Death is hardly more bitter. And yet to treat the good I found there as well, I'll tell you what I saw, though how I came to enter I cannot well say. Being so full of sleep, whatever moment it was, I began to blunder off the true path. This is the onset of the poet's journey through the land of the dead. Of this decisive moment in life, C.G. Jung comments as follows, I quote, "A point exists at about 35 the 35th year when things begin to change. It is the first moment of the shadow side of life, of the going down to death. It is clear that Dante found this point. When this turning point comes, people meet it in several ways. Some turn away from it. Others plunge into it. And something important happens to yet others from the outside. If we do not see a thing, fate does it to us." Unquote. Fortunately for Dante, a guide, the poet Virgil, is sent for his assistance by his beloved Beatrice. At the instigation of St. Lucy and the Virgin Mary. This guidance, sent ultimately by the self in Jungian terms, will prove decisive in the journey. Without Virgil, Dante would remain an eternally lost soul, adrift and without direction. Virgil will guide him onto an altogether unknown and unfamiliar path toward his goal, which bypasses the threatening beasts, symbols of pride, the lion, lust, the leopard, and most critically, avarice, the ever-hungry wolf sent from hell by envy. The two poets will follow what Jung in the Red Book called the spirit of the depths, as opposed to the spirit of the times. In hell, the inferno, Dante witnesses all the folly and weakness humanity is heir to when given over to the compulsive and permanent attachment of soul to body. Here are the souls who refuse to let go of their passions or even attempt to separate themselves from the objects of their desire. And here they suffer the dire consequences of their persistence. Jung writes as follows about the challenges of this opus contra naturam that we are referring to as the achievement of unio mentalis. Since the soul animates the body, Jung writes, she tends to favor the body and everything bodily, sensuous and emotional. She lies caught in the chains of physis, and she desires beyond physical necessity. The separation means withdrawing the soul and her projections from the bodily sphere and from all environmental conditions relating to the body. The disciple will have every opportunity to discover the dark side of his personality, his inferior wishes and motives, childish fantasies and resentments. In short, all those traits he habitually hides from himself. He will be confronted with his shadow. The most poignant story that Dante hears in hell, which actually causes him to faint, is the tale of Francesca and Paolo in the second circle of hell. Francesca is a strong representative of the soul's attachment to the body and serves for Dante, lover that he is, as a critical test, a test case of his movement toward unio mentalis. Francesca shows no remorse for her adulterous love for Paolo, even as she perversely lays blame on romantic poets like Dante for the onset of her attachment to her lover. And she confesses that despite the punishment dealt out to both of them, she still clings to him. She says, "Love, which absolves none who are loved from loving, made my heart burn with joy so strong that as you see it cleaves still to him here. Love gave us both one death." Obsessive sensual love is a folly hard for Dante to condemn, since in much of his previous poetry he celebrated the glories of courtly love. And yet he does so, albeit with tender words and obvious anguish, and he moves on with his steady guide Virgil, who represents the assistance of spirit, which presses Dante to advance. The movement toward unio mentalis, writes Jung, is assisted by, quote, the help of the spirit, by which are meant all the higher mental faculties such as reason, insight, and moral discrimination, unquote. And more than that, Virgil will guide Dante to figures who represent, quote, a window into eternity, and convey to the soul a certain divine influx and the knowledge of higher things, unquote. As we shall see so well and dramatically in the third canticle, Paradiso. I'm reluctant to draw a parallel to psychoanalytic work, but the temptation is great to observe that Virgil functions much like an analyst who accompanies a client or a patient struggling with shadow material as it emerges in the stage of analysis that Jung calls confession. In studying the Divine Comedy, I have been fascinated by Virgil and a voice of encouragement. And I find kinship with the part he plays in serving as a witness, and a voice of encouragement and guide when the anguish of guilt and shame mount like the furies that confront Dante and Virgil as they enter the inferno. It is a long and necessary journey through all the shades of shadow realization that precedes the eventual mounting into the next stage of the conjunctio. Why is this necessary? Why can't Virgil bypass hell and purgatory and just take Dante straight up to paradise and turn him over to Beatrice? In the years of working as a Jungian psychoanalyst, I have occasionally witnessed the sad consequences of this leap over the shadow into what was claimed to be liberation or enlightenment or satori. The leap over shadow does not eliminate the shadow. It only avoids the problems that will later return and bring the person right back to the beginning of the journey. The shadow must be faced and worked through deeply, painfully, even at times hopelessly, in order to prepare the soul for its union with spirit in the unio mentalis and its next step of reuniting with the body in an entirely new way. In the alchemical depiction of the achievement of unio mentalis, there is first a demand for separation of the soul from the body, and second, a matrimonial union of the soul with spirit. The first, the separation, is a moral achievement, and the second, the matrimony, is a commitment. In Dante's Divine Comedy, the first step takes place by observing carefully the shadow enactments in the inferno and the consequences of clinging to the body. This is followed by the painful experience of confessing and working through a final separation from the shadow of instinctual, unconscious existence. Leaving the inferno decisively requires facing absolute evil and descending to the freezing, cold bottom of hell. This plumbing the depths of evil is an experience of the archetypal psyche and belongs to an experience of the self. It means to look absolute evil in the face, which is, as Jung writes in his late work, Ion, a shattering experience, erschütternde Erfahrung. When Virgil shows Dante the figure of Lucifer and tells him, look, here is Dis, and here is the place where you must arm yourself with the quality of fortitude, Dante confesses, how chilled and faint I was on hearing that. You must not ask me, reader. I do not write it. Words would not suffice. Virgil guides Dante in the descent down the very bottom of this emperor of the realm of grief, as he's called, at which point direction suddenly reverses and the way down becomes the way upward. Now they can make their way through a narrow passage and begin an ascent toward the realms of purgatory. Thus far, however, Dante has been a passive witness to the shadow. The shadow figures who are frozen in place in hell that the two pilgrims have encountered. To enter purgatory, however, a commitment is required to face rigorously and honestly the shadow features of the personality and to transform them. The 3 steps at the entry to purgatorio represent heartfelt contrition, that's the white step at the bottom, confession, the black step, and ardor for good works, the red step. Unlike hell, which features characters who are frozen in place, purgatory is a realm dedicated to change and transformation. Here there is an ethical commitment to work through the shadow traits of the ego. In purgatorio, these are listed in order as pride, envy, anger, sloth, avarice, greed, and lust. Each must be transformed through suffering and replaced by 7 corresponding virtues. The master guardian of the gate opens it for Dante and Virgil, and with his sword carves 7 P's, the 7 scars of sin, into the poet's brow. Each of these will be removed as he progresses through the levels of purgatory in order to be cleared of all the vices and certified that he has achieved the virtues. Then he can pass on beyond the gates of purgatory to paradiso. Dante can now fully trust himself and his impulses, Virgil tells him. In psychological terms, he has achieved the creation of a solid ego-self axis, a reliable inner guide that replaces the assistance he has needed before from Virgil. The union of soul and spirit has been largely accomplished, and Dante is now prepared to take the next steps on his journey on his own. This will go beyond poetry, as represented by the archetypal poet of antiquity, Virgil, to prophecy, as instilled through experience in the heavenly realms. The final stage, the union of unio mentalis with body and unus mundus. When Dante leaves the realm of shadow, negredo, and approaches the pure light, albedo and rubedo, he is met by Beatrice, who will lead him into heaven. As psychologists, we see Beatrice as the inner anima figure. And for this decisive movement into her circle, Dante must relinquish the body entirely. That is, his sense of self as controlled by his complexes and personal history must be put away entirely. This transformation is achieved by going through fire, being immersed in Lethe, the river Lethe, the river of forgetfulness, and then drinking deeply of the waters of the river Unoi, which instills a sense of self as primal essence, the original self as imago Dei. Here Dante becomes purified unio mentalis, and his body is now transformed into a subtle body that no longer obeys the laws of gravity. Having reached the stage of unio mentalis, his soul is one with spirit. The instinctual body has fallen away and the spiritual reigns supreme. When soul commits absolutely to spirit, consciousness enters a realm of subtle bodies and visionary experience, a 5th dimension, as it is sometimes called by contemporary philosophers of religion, a 5th dimension. The figures Dante encounters in this realm are supramundane, and in this respect they are different from the concrete and vivid figures encountered in the Inferno and Purgatorio. Beatrice, although a symbol of eros in the highest sense of the meaning of love, surprisingly speaks in the exalted language of logos, as she instructs and shows Dante the essential architecture of the universe. In this stage of the journey, Dante has gone beyond memory and poetic imagination as represented by Virgil, and now he speaks with a type of imagination that is visionary and reveals the primal forms and structures of being itself. This is the world of pure archetype, entry into which is assisted, as Jung wrote, by the spirit, which is also a window into eternity and conveys to the soul a certain divine influx and the knowledge of higher things, unquote. Having achieved unio mentalis, the poet is able to enter into a degree of active imagination that goes beyond ordinary poetic imagination and traverses the limits of conscious mental capacities to reveal an ultimate mystery. Jung writes about this type of experience after he had his overpowering numinous visions in his 70s. Jung wrote, "I would never have imagined that any such experience was possible. It was not a product of imagination. The visions and experiences were utterly real. There was nothing subjective about them. They all had a quality of absolute objectivity. The objectivity which I experienced in the visions is part of completed individuation. It signifies detachment from valuations and from what we call emotional ties," unquote. What Dante describes in Paradiso is a revelation of the objective order of the cosmos and its fundamental underlying energic organization. The cantos of Paradiso, leading up to the final revelation of the Creator, describe in order the realms of all creation. It's an ascent from the earthly paradise through the circles of the planets and stars to the exalted Empyrean. Here Dante sees the mystical rose. Dante's educational lessons in paradise, as delivered by Beatrice, the apostles, and Saint Bernard, are all aimed at preparing him for this nea plus ultra, the ultimate vision, which is described in the 100th and final canto of the Divine Comedy. This is the scene of the achievement of the second and third stages of the Mysterium Conjunctionis, as outlined by Gerhard Dorn and expounded by Jung. The visionary union of the unio mentalis with the unus mundus, and subsequently incarnated in a transformed man, that is, in the poet Dante himself. In Jung's view, quote, this would consist, psychologically speaking, in a synthesis of the conscious with the unconscious, unquote. Saint Bernard speaks to Dante that he should follow, quote, the ray of that one light, which of itself is true, unquote. The poet turns there and gazes steadily at that light. Within its depths, this light I saw, contained, bound up, and gathered in a single book, the leaves that scatter through the universe, beings and accidents and modes of life, as though blown all together in a way that what I say is just a simple light, unquote. It is a vision of totality that takes in all of history at one glance. Beyond that, as he gazes into the light, some details emerge. A vision of the Holy Trinity, 3 circling spheres, further differentiates somewhat, and Dante sees the human form imaged in one of them. As he gazes deeply into this mystery, he reaches the limit of his poetic capacity and confesses, quote, "But mine were wings that could not rise to that, save that with this my mind was stricken through by sudden lightning, bringing what it wished." This sudden lightning strike marks the critical moment of transformation, and it issues in the union of unio mentalis with unus mundus. The result is expressed in the sublime language that only a poet can inscribe. All powers of high imagining here failed, but now my will and my desire were turned as wheels that move in equilibrium by love that moves the sun and other stars. The poet has arrived at a state of full union in body, soul, and spirit with unus mundus. Individuation is complete insofar as this is humanly possible. Dante died the night of September 13th, 1321, having just finished the final cantos of the Paradiso. Legend tells us, writes Harold Bloom, that Dante was pointed out in the streets as the man who had somehow returned from a voyage to hell, as though he were a kind of shaman. We can assume that he believed in the reality of his visions. A poet of such force, who judged himself to be a true prophet, would not have regarded his descent into hell as mere metaphor, unquote. A short conclusion. The outcome of the three stages in the process of transformation is a transformed personality, as the Divine Comedy clearly shows. As psychotherapists, we might ask, is this true? Or is this fantasy on a high level, but fiction nevertheless? Do numinous experiences, such as are described in the Divine Comedy, make a real difference in how people feel about themselves and life, and how they behave toward others, and how they formulate the meaning of life in the final analysis? And does the effect last? From our experiences as Jungian psychoanalysts, we can certainly testify that deep engagement with dreams and active imagination over a period of time does make a difference. While this does not remove all the effects of trauma and the consequent complexes completely, it does strongly assist a person in outgrowing them and relativizing them. The creation of an ego-self connection on an inner level shifts the locus of control from persona concerns about prestige and power to a degree of acceptance of self and others. And beyond that, there are experiences that give a perspective on life that frames personal life experience in a more objective concept. In some cases, this makes the difference between choosing life and death. This would testify to the veracity of Dante's claim that desire and will can finally turn in harmony with the love that moves the sun and other stars. I prefer to take the portrait of the unconscious world as portrayed in the Divine Comedy in its totality, hell, purgatory, and heaven, as a mandala that describes human wholeness. There are parts of the personality that are frozen in place and will never change. The figures depicted in the Inferno. These are intransigent complexes that continue to exist even in the advanced stages of individuation and old age. There are other parts that can be transformed, the figures in Purgatorio. These are amenable to change and are capable of undergoing transformation. And there are parts in the archetypal realm of the psyche that are glimpsed from time to time in visions, dreams, and numinous experiences. These are the figures depicted in the exalted realm of heaven in Paradiso. Ego consciousness can locate itself principally in any one of these realms and will travel through them many times in the course of a long individuation process. It is possible that in later life, if a state of wisdom is achieved as seen in the Divine Comedy, the predominant position will be fixed more or less steadily by the achievement of a full union with Unus Mundus. Even if this is not seen very often as the outcome of the individuation processes that are unleashed and fostered in Jungian psychoanalysis, this can still serve as the goal of individuation potential. That is my hope and my faith. Thank you very much.